Hello, Steven.
Hey.
Welcome back to Out of the Aether. Here's a game that I've been playing recently. It's a hotly anticipated game for the two of us, two huge fans of Sayonara Wild Hearts.
Yeah.
That's like maybe one of my favorite games ever. If you haven't played it, great rhythm game. Go check it out. It's available for like most stuff. And it's just a dream to play and also a dream to listen to.
Great soundtrack. I also remember thinking while playing it, I felt like this is how Brendan sees the world. I felt you said that about Elite Beat agents for my brain.
Yes.
Like I thought this is like your Persona Palace.
Yes.
In a good way, is Sayonara Wild Hearts.
I was a big Sayonara Wild Hearts fan, but I was also a big fan of the developer Sumogo. They Sayonara Wild Hearts is a weird game for them because it's kind of counter to a lot of the other stuff that they have made in the past. They're more known for kind of like darker, harder puzzle games. The idea of them making this like bright, vibrant, like pop album turned video game is like so counter to what they're known for that I think it's just like a big swing that worked out for them.
Totally.
But they just released a new game called Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, and it is a little bit more of a return to form for them, but it does feel like it has some elements, I think, artistically of what's going on in Sayonara Wild Hearts. I will say from my first like 2 hours with it, I am not like as over the moon about it as I was expecting to be, I'll say. And I thought that it would be an interesting game to talk about just from the perspective of like how puzzle games work for us in general.
Yeah.
Because another game that came out recently that you and I have talked about on the main show, Into the Aether, was Animal Well, which is like obviously a huge deal when it came out. But that's the first game being published by Big Mode. It's by a solo developer named Billy Basso. And on the episode, I described it as, you know, the first game since Fez to make me feel like I was playing a game like Fez. Like I think like taking inspiration from Fez is really interesting. And Animal Well is like going after that. But I do think there's a pretty stark difference between what these two games are asking you to do, despite both being puzzle games that have come out from indie developers and immediately gotten like perfect scores from people. They are technically part of the same genre, but coming at it from completely different angles. So Animal Well, I'm sure you've seen or heard of before. And to be clear, we're not going to like spoil how you do stuff in these games. We're not going to spoil any puzzles. The video that you are watching in conjunction with this will be from probably maybe the first 5 to 10 minutes of both of those games. And, you know, I'll be very diligent to make sure that I'm not spoiling too much stuff in the video capture for those, just to be clear. But Animal Well is a game that is more about just like running around a big 2D space that is like kind of Metroidvania adjacent because you get a big map and it looks like a Metroidvania map. But you're essentially just running around trying to figure out how to progress and interacting with the world and trying to use the interactions of the world. So like the different items that you get and the different ways in which the animals in the well are reacting to your presence there as your method of progression. It's very similar to Fez in that Fez was kind of on its surface a game about just exploring a space and rotating that space using their like fun use the shoulder buttons to rotate the whole world mechanic. But beneath the surface, there were a bunch of like very, very secret, very hidden ways that you could interact with the world that would not be obvious to you unless you'd played a lot of Fez or unless you kind of had your like aha brain blast moment. And even then, that's like on a screen to screen basis. It's not like figuring out one of the anti-cubes in Fez is going to mean that you understand all of them. You really need to be thinking outside of the box in a lot of the spaces that you're in Fez to make that work. And Animal Well is kind of similar to that. Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, though, is just like straight up puzzle game. And on the main episode this week, you and I talked a little bit about Crow Country, and you mentioned that there's this mode in Crow Country where you can just turn off the like zombie encounters and kind of like the survival horror aspect. And we were talking about what that leaves behind when you're able to turn that stuff off. And the answer is not so dissimilar from Lorelei, it sounds like, because Lorelei and the Laser Eyes is a game where you are playing as a character who is making your way through this big mansion where something has happened. I won't say what. That something has happened, and to progress, you need to just literally be solving puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. The first one, so easy. I don't feel bad giving this one away at all, but literally the first one is a piece of paper that's like, this thing happened in 1963, 1 year earlier, this thing happened. And literally they have underlined 1963 and 1 year earlier, and right next to it is a padlock with 4 numbers. So it's like, okay, 1963 minus 1 is 1962. That's the answer to that padlock. Cool, you've made it through. But it's that over and over and over and over again, and increasingly more difficult, and starting to use the environment in more interesting ways and starting to ask you bigger questions about how you're interacting with the environment. You are constantly just like reading through books that have like paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of text and seeing if you can figure out answers. And that is not so dissimilar from like those early Resident Evil games that you love.
Yeah, as you've been talking, I've been trying to think to myself about what puzzle games work for me, and also defining puzzle game even, because I think like they're one example of puzzle game in its most kind of definitive form is like Patrick's Parabox, which is a puzzle game that you and I really like, that is not simple because it's about like going into a box inside of a box, and it's even hard to describe. I'm glad we have video capture here to maybe show what on earth I'm talking about. But that's a game that is like making the rules abundantly clear. You are a square pushing boxes, and you have to push a box into the goal, and then it becomes more abstract on top of that. And I think
it's like a recursive version of that game everyone had on their calculators.
Yeah, exactly. But I think for me, the puzzle games that work, and I think the mission of any developer making a puzzle game is making the rules abundantly clear. And I think what makes a game like Animal Well so hard to design, and what makes Metroidvanias so hard to design, which I think, incorporate puzzle elements, is that sometimes the rules themselves have to be discovered. And how can you make that? How can you break what was maybe the central rule of puzzle game design to make it fun when you discover the rules and not like totally frustrating? Because I think that the thing that I never want to feel while playing a puzzle game is, how was I supposed to know that?
Right.
How was, there are so many older, like I love old Resident Evil. I love old Silent Hill. I love old games, let's be honest. But I think the thing that always happens with any older game is like you reach this point where you can't progress, regardless of genre, regardless of if it's even a puzzle game. And then you look up some ancient game facts guide and they're like, talk to the woman with purple hair in the town you already left. How on earth was I supposed to know that? Recent puzzle games that have really worked for me that I think incorporate an exploration element. One game that really worked for me was Chants of Sennaar, which is a game all about language. And I think similar to that first puzzle, like, again, I don't feel bad spoiling the first puzzle of Chants of Sennaar, is like you see all these, this water coming out of faucets and you learn like on and off basically right away. It's a game where you're navigating this environment that has a fictional language and you have to solve puzzles through language. So even though that game can be tricky and it can be hard to like learn the right word, the game makes the rules very clear. You always know what you're searching for. And the game is also very generous when like, if you write in your journal a word kind of like the right word, it will consider it solved. It will tell you like, actually it's this, but like you were close enough.
You almost got it. Yeah.
Right. That way it's like, I wrote down cat, but it was feline. Something like that.
Yeah.
It's like,
unlike so something like Return of the Obra Dinn, which, no room for error at all. It's like, name, how did they die? If you don't have those two things, you did not solve the puzzle.
And the thing about all of this, I mean, everything ultimately is subjective, but I think for puzzle games, there are people who really like the don't hold my hand at all, make me write notes down, make me like actually become a detective to do this. And then for me, I get really easily lost. So once there is an exploration element, that's why I could never really get into The Witness. I just found, or another game that I really wanted to love but didn't was Paradise Killer, where I loved the art style and the characters and the music, but like just the act of walking around that environment, I found it to be like, on one hand it was cool to see the scenery, but I found that added step got in the way of the part of the game that I liked and added to the confusion. And that's more of an investigation game, but I think it's puzzle adjacent. One example that you and I always talk about is Ace Attorney. Where like I adore Ace Attorney, but I think it's probably not controversial to say that the court cases are more fun than the investigation phases.
Right.
And I think that really boils down to like, if we don't know what we're looking for, then the puzzle becomes more frustrating than satisfying when we finally find the answer. I think, I highly recommend Game Maker's Toolkit, that YouTube channel in general, but there's a video about puzzle game design and how there's usually what's called the catch, where like it's the moment the player realizes what they have to do, but then realizes what's standing in the way of it. And not every puzzle needs that, especially when maybe the puzzle is more abstract than something in Patrick's Parabox. But I do think there needs to be a version of that, and I think maybe it's just because, again, this is subjective. People learn differently and people have different preferences over like the coveted eureka moment of a puzzle game. But I think for me, I need clear rules and I need to not get lost.
Right.
Those are like the two things I need to enjoy a puzzle game, and why I've bounced off some other games that are somewhere within the genre.
A weird shout out here might be a series of games that you and I just played all of for a bonus episode, which is Uncharted.
Yeah.
Because Uncharted is very good about locking you in one room in particular. No way to get lost at all. All you're left with is, here's the space you need to get out of, and you have Nathan's journal, and you're just flipping through pages in Nathan's journal, and that's how you're solving your puzzles. Like, that's kind of the dream in those situations, against maybe something like a game that we dunk on maybe more than it deserves, but God of War Ragnarok, which at least at launch before they patched it, had such a tendency of giving away the answer to the puzzle immediately. Like, you would walk into a space that was supposed to be a puzzle, and then within like maybe 3 minutes, like just when you started to understand what the pieces of the puzzle are, you've like explored the space, you're like, okay, I can start solving this now. Atreus or whoever else is with you would be like, what if you did that? What if you cut that rope there? It's like,
and it's not even a hint. It's just like, what if you solve the puzzle?
What if you solve the puzzle?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And I understand that instinct to a certain degree, because like, again, the delicate balance is you want the player to feel armed with knowledge and not get stuck to the point of being frustrated, but you also want it to feel earned.
Because for something like God of War Ragnarok, that's not why most players are there. They're not there to be
puzzles are there
puzzles.
to kind of fill time. It's sort of just to break up the combat sequences.
Right.
So like, I get why maybe, but even in combat, and that's a separate conversation, but combat, the people would be like, try parrying, like the minute you're in the thick of battle, and it's like, can you trust me at all? Can you trust Kratos just a little bit?
He's done a lot of stuff.
Maybe that's the key word, is trust.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the developer has to trust that players will eventually find it, and that speaks to the confidence of the design. I think the games that maybe I have bounced off of are just, I think they're great games, and it seems like more of a me problem than the game, but I just think like there is that very delicate line between trust in the player, trust in the design, but also giving them enough. And that's why it's so hard to design for, because like games in general are hard to make, but like as the developer, you know the solution. So you really have no context for how hard the puzzle actually is until you watch people play it, which is why it takes so much playtesting to fine tune a puzzle game. And why I think we have conversations like this where maybe we can't find a definitive answer over what works and what doesn't. But I think just on a subjective level, we can say what has worked and what we prefer.
Yeah. I think a great shout out actually is like right at the beginning of Lorelei and the Laser Eyes. You have to get into your car for a second. You actually don't even need to. You could just leave. But right at the beginning of the game, you can get into your car and you can open up the glove box. And in the glove box is the actual manual for the video game. It's like, you know, Simogo wrote out what the manual is. Even in the situation where like Simogo is telling you, quote unquote, how to play the game, there's stuff where they're talking about like, you know, directional input. The player character walks in the direction pressed. If the player character has enough caffeine in her blood, she will instead run. And that's all you're getting about how to move around in the video game. It's like, oh, there's a caffeine mechanic? What does that mean? I have no idea. At what point am I going to find caffeine? Are there espresso machines all over the place? Are there like pour over coffees just available for me in this big haunted mansion? I have no idea. There's stuff like, listen very carefully if a person wearing an owl mask speaks. Again, you're at the beginning of the game, you don't even know what you're doing. Like, that is the level of trust, I think, that you have in the player to either retain that information, know to take a screenshot of it like I did and just read from, or alternatively, allow players to... Actually, this game also, in the beginning of the manual, it's like, you should have a notebook and you should be writing stuff down at all times. And, you know, did they write down that you should pay attention when a person in an owl mask speaks? Also, why would you not pay attention if somebody showed up in an owl mask and started talking to you?
I don't need to listen to them. I mean, owls have forever, if you're of a certain age, you've been traumatized by the owl from Ocarina of Time asking you if you want to hear what they said again. So I'm just like muscle memory, like, yeah, I will listen to the owl. Exactly once though.
Who?
On that note, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
You want to wrap up? All right. See you, everybody.
You can't top who, you know? You can't top who is what we learned. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.